Terrific to have you, and as I said, my name's Anne Tien and I'm Professor and Director of the Policy Innovation Hub at Griffith, and it's a big pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. I'd like to start by paying my respects to the Indigenous people and traditional owners of the site on which we're meeting, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's just great to have such a turnout this afternoon to talk about this important issue, changing our approach to social investment, dreaming big for Australia. And it's a pleasure as Director of something new that we've established at Griffith, the Policy Innovation Hub, which is really trying very much to harness the capacity, resources and expertise that exists across the different networks that the university engages with towards some of our biggest public policy challenges. And there's just so much interest in this whole issue of an investment approach to social policy, really trying to crack some of the most complex and enduring and entrenched social problems that we face, and trying to improve and make a real difference to the lives of some of the most vulnerable Queenslanders. So we're pleased to be able to, in the sort of the 40-year public policy tradition of Griffith, provide a platform for debate and discussion, and I'm really pleased to have the three guests, this terrific panel that we've assembled this afternoon. Matthew Cox from Logan Together, who'll be known to many of you, Belinda Drew from the Community Services Industry Alliance, and Dave Copeman from the Queensland Community Alliance. We've really been pleased with the turnout, and we're very happy that Minister Fentiman is going to join us. There's been question time in the Queensland Parliament, you know, such as it is, delayed for a condolence motion, and she's due out at about 4:30, so we're hoping that she'll be able to beetle through the building and make her way across. So we might might introduce Dave to begin with, and sort of the broad plan is that people will sort of speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll throw it open to questions. We've got the forum being live streamed by some of the terrifically talented people from Griffith University down the back, and it'll also be available if people want to make use of the link back into their organisations. So Dave, from Queensland Community Alliance, can I introduce you to talk about citizen power and its relationship to government and the system? And what we'll do is we'll get Dave to speak first, and then when Minister Fentiman arrives, we'll break. So can you join me in welcoming Dave, please?
I might use this. G'day everyone. I might use this because I can muck around with that screen. My name's Dave Copeman, lead organiser, Queensland Community Alliance, and I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and also the history of violence and dispossession that occurred in Brisbane and in this location in particular, but also to acknowledge the Indigenous leaders. We're in a place of leadership, and there are Indigenous members of Parliament who have, as part of that struggle for rights and for recognition, have overcome that exclusion and are currently sitting asking smart and not so smart questions of each other in the state parliament. So I want to acknowledge both that past and that present. I want to start with a quote about change, just to kick us off. So let's see if this works. If it doesn't, then it's my fault.
Nobody knows the system better than me. Which is why I alone can fix it. Nobody knows the system better than me.
It doesn't get any better looking if it's not. Why did I play that? Because I guess my position is the exact opposite. That no one person, no one expert, no one policy approach, no one kind of approach to investment is going to address the challenges we face. And that instead of one person standing up, and I'm going to move that on pretty soon, instead of one person standing up saying it's all about me and I alone can fix it, that actually for the most difficult challenges we face in terms of community investment, that real change will require engagement of our community, of the communities that are affected, leaders within those communities, and the civil society organisations that make up the webs and the fabrics of connection in those areas. It will be all of them coming together that will be necessary to address some of the most complex and thorny and wicked problems that we face around the issues of social investment and how we change it. So I guess that's a narrative that comes out in in a lot of our political discourse. I have the solution, I have the answers, trust me. And I think what we need to do is flip that on its head. And not just say, we don't accept this particular candidate for President of the United States, but challenge that culture more broadly within our systems of delivery of services and systems of funding, to actually move from a top-down 1940s, Wall Street and ultimately military-based model to one that's engaging, adaptive, and involves everyone. So over the next 10 or so minutes, I'll have a chat about one way that we see of changing that, of disrupting that power imbalance, which we call broad-based community organising, which the Queensland Community Alliance seeks to exemplify. But before I do that, as part of my tradition, I should introduce myself and why I'm here. Why do I care about this? And there was a thing up there which is a photo of a sinkhole in Russia. And that's why. I care about broad-based community organising because of that. And more, not just because of methane sinkholes in Russia, but because of my son. So I don't know if people are familiar about this. Don't worry, it's not a long speech about climate change. But there are some really scary circumstances where methane, which is stored in the Siberian tundra, which is over 100 years, 25% more intensive in terms of climate change than carbon dioxide, and over 20 years it goes up because it only lasts a shorter period in the atmosphere. It's 84 times more, has more impact molecule for molecule than carbon. There's big, rapid expulsions of methane out of the Siberian tundra. And the reason I care about that is because of my son, Felix. I have two kids, Felix and Indigo. Felix is 6 and he really wants to be a scientist. He's not so interested in the books around, adventures and exploring. He doesn't mind the multi-level treehouse books, but he really loves science books. And he gets these science books and science DVDs for me to watch or to watch with me because he gets that I have a bit of an interest in it. And one of his favourite books is actually about climate change. And one of the things that I find toughest is reading that book to him because it's really, at a personal level, deeply agitational to think that in his lifetime, these things can happen, these things are happening, but these things are going to have a huge impact on his life. And so that's why I work on better outcomes for community power in Logan and in Brisbane and in Ipswich. And that's been a bit of a tension for me, but the reason that I've connected those two and said, no, there is a connection, is that if you look at the problems of climate change, the problem is not a scientific one. Science will help us. We need more science. I certainly think the CSIA scientists should be there helping us document it. But the problem we have around addressing climate change is a problem of making the political shifts we need to adapt. The technology is simple. We need to reduce emissions and alter the ways that we operate in our economy, and it's a political challenge to achieve that. And what we need to affect that political challenge is confidence that we can actually change some of the small ways that our economies work, our energy systems work, that people can have the power to make that change. And it's that basis of power, that basis of engaging people to be involved in decisions that are going to impact them, and teaching people those basic processes of how do they connect, how do they stand up for what matters to them, that is at the heart of organising, and it's what I would argue at the heart of how we achieve the big shifts we need to in social investment in Australia so that we can achieve the results that for the last 25 or 30 years we haven't been. In those wicked problems, those areas, and the other panellists will speak about these later, where we've been pouring money into programs and not seeing the results we need. So that's why I'm here. And the argument I'm making, as I said at the introductions, it starts with all of us. It starts with all of our organisations learning how to teach people to stand up and to engage in policy debates as citizens. Now, all of you are here for a range of different reasons, and I'm not sure of it all. How many people are part of Professor Ann's course from Griffith? Or connected in some way to Griffith? Okay, great. Who's connected to the Logan Together process? Okay. Where are the rest of you from? I'm guessing others are part of the Community Service Industry Association? Or connected to that? No? Or just generally interested? Government. Great, okay. this is a rehash or an improvement on a panel that that Matt and Belinda and myself did with the Coalition of Community Boards at a conference in Logan, and so we're adapting it to a new audience. My argument there, and basically my argument here, is that if we're going to effectively achieve the outcomes that we invest in terms of new social investments, we need a stronger civil society, and we need ordinary people to be part of those processes through civil society institutions of not just being part of the design or consultation around how those funds are invested and spent, but actually feel that they have the power to act over the things that matter in their life through that investment and through their organisations, their civil society organisations standing up. Now, what do I mean by civil society? I mean the places that people learn where to lead, the places where they're given the opportunities to speak, to learn, to make judgments as adults, to come together around the values they care about. So their church or their faith organisation, their union, their community organisation, their neighbourhood group, their PNC, their ethnic association, their sporting club. And we argue in organising that it's those institutions that are where people come together and build connections and build values. And it's those institutions that need to be engaged, not just as deliverers of service or as people who are brought into consultation, but actually as people who have power and hold decision makers to account, hold bureaucracy to account, hold government to account, hold large NGOs and service organisations to account for the promises they make. Because if we're going to move away from an attitude which is all, top down, listen to me, the scariness of what we see in the United States, and there was a precursor program to Logan Together, which we're going to talk about soon, called The Next Step, or the Logan Beanley Young Persons Project. And this was a whole lot of organisations saying, if we keep on providing services to this cohort of disadvantaged families, and particularly young people, nothing seems to change. It was, mainly looking at young women, girls who were from 2 or 3 generations of unemployment, and where the likely outcome was that they were also going to become mothers before they were 18, and that the government system, whether it's prison, youth justice, child safety, would be very involved in their life, but none of that would actually lead to any positive outcome. So this was 5 different organisations working together saying, how do we not just deliver our service and go, tick, we've had a case management meeting or we've had a this, but how do we actually get them to the next step that we know is necessary to address this problem? Because the simple steps of, getting people on with their lives and achieving good outcomes, again, that's not hard. We know what's involved in that. But the challenge was getting people to that. So to cut a long story short, those 5 organisations took a while, and then I think Queensland Health took about a year more of a while of working out how to report on that and to shape it all and work on together. But they were beginning to get results. And then, governments changed as they did, and the program was scrapped. And that's not the first time that that's happened in Logan, and it might not even be the 1000th time that's happened in Logan. There's an old joke that Logan's seen more pilots than Qantas, but which many people here probably heard before. But what happened that really got me angry was when I went out and I was starting to organise. I was talking to people in this area, and I said, had you heard of this program? I was talking to a parish priest in Woodridge, and he said to me, he's got a very strong Chicago accent, and he said to me, the thing that I care about is the unwed mothers, the streets of unwed mothers up in this street. Not the language I would have used, but it was this program that he was talking about. I said, oh, did you know about this? And he said, no, I didn't know anything about this program. I later discovered that while that program was on, he was on the board of one of the largest community service organisations in Logan and still didn't know anything about it. And I just thought, was it a secret? Was this work that we were doing so hidden that people had no connection to it, that we were hiding it away? And ultimately what the problem was is there was no ownership. No one was owned it, no one connected to it. And that problem wasn't just that no one was there to fight when the funding was cut, is that no one actually had a sense of this is how we can improve our community, this is how we can address the safety in our local area. So in our community organising, let me see if I can make this work. No? Oh, I've got a pointer, that's cool. Can you click to the next slide? Okay, neither of us can click to the next slide. We'll keep going. Oh, did I just turn it off? Okay, anyway. In our community organising, the Queensland Community Alliance is a range of churches, unions, community organisations and ethnic associations. We come out of the community organising tradition of the United States. And so we build relationships one-on-one, we listen to the pressures that are faced in our community, and then we, through those organisations, take action together to hold decision makers to account. And our ultimate goal, the goal that we see that we do this, is getting ordinary people through their organisations taking leadership roles around the issues that matter to them and wrestling with these hard problems themselves. And the ultimate goal of that is not just to achieve the change we need, but to get an even bigger shift, a cultural shift, where people, instead of just seeing the short knee-jerk responses, oh, that kid's bad, you know, lock them up, throw away the key, they understand the difficulties of what's going on, and they realise that they do what Daniel Kahnemeyer in the book Thinking Fast and Slow talks about, which is engage that second stage process where you put down the heuristic, the short, simple answer of this is how I solve things without thinking about it, and you actually wrestle with the complexity and the difficulty of these big social issues as an ordinary citizen. But you do so not alone, you do so with your church or your union or community organisation helping you translate and understand that. And so this organising is bringing those people together, building that people power to hold people account, but looking at that goal of learning. So we're active in Logan and Ipswich and Brisbane. We're looking at doing some work in Caboolture. And if anyone wants to find out more about community organising, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. But ultimately, this is one of the reasons we're working about this, to use a US example, because Trump is, inshallah, going to lose. But what we do see is that there will still be that knee-jerk short-term response. Okay, so this is why the unions and churches who are involved in the Alliance have come together to take action. This is why we've also seen that building citizen power to support the project Logan Together that Matthew Cox is going to talk about is so important, because this is a program that's still looking to address those long-term causes. But it's also why I'm interested in coming and speaking here to you tonight, this afternoon. For some of you, I guess I want to make an offer. I want to say, if you're interested in building civil society power and citizen power for ordinary people to take action, then I want to have a conversation with you about that. But to those of you who are going to be experts, going to be going into roles in government or already in roles in government or in large organisations, I want to come finally with you with a challenge that if we're going to effectively make this transition to have people engaged in those complex issues, then it's not just that civil society has to organise, you have to change. Because the culture of expert is not like, you know, in some ways Trump is an antithesis to expert, but what he's standing on, if he's standing not on the shoulders of giants, he's standing on a culture that says, don't worry about it, I'm the expert. That heuristic is now so short, it's don't worry about it, I'm rich, I'm powerful, I will do it. But the culture of saying an expert only is the person who can solve something is one of the challenges that we have to change. While we've got to have information-driven, accountable, evidence-based policy, it's got to be one that's connected to ordinary people's lives and that they can engage with. And that they can say, well, my story and my engagement in this matters. And so what does that mean for experts? I'd argue that it means that if your role is sitting back just understanding the sociology of how things work and looking at the best programs that have achieved the best results for, you know, improving outcomes for kids 0 to 8, and you're not engaged in teaching and wrestling and having those complex discussions that leads to that type 2, that slower thinking and wrestling about it, then in some ways you're a beneficiary of all that's brought you there, but you're doing nothing to challenge and to subvert that dominant culture that says, you stay out of it, ordinary people, this is only for the experts. And if you're going to take all of that advantage, but not be involved in the wrestling and the confrontation, the discussion of ideas, then arguably, and I'm going to say something agitational here, if I've got people's permission, but if people are in that position of authority, and this is a great time for the minister to walk in, if people are in that position of authority, are the beneficiaries of that, but they're saying, I'll have the power, but I won't engage in those hard discussions, then really, you guys are as much a leech as people lay out that welfare recipients are. Because you're not actually helping address the underlying culture that challenges some of these existing problems. The problems that are there because they work for someone. And if we're not building power in those who are damaged and hurt by the systems of inequality, if we're not engaged in that process, if we're just saying, well, it's my job just to show up and do the policy work, and if people don't listen to me, well, then what can I do? No, forget about it. Then I'm not interested in that, and I'm not interested in you. So, on that note, the final point I want to say is that actually most of the people I've worked in this area are not that hollow example and they're actually desperate to engage and challenge. And some of the best bureaucrats and the best politicians I know have a deep desire and understanding to say, we need to connect with people, we need to challenge people to stand up for what matters to them. In organising, we apply and we challenge our community to apply what we call the iron rule. We complement the golden rule with an iron rule of never do for others what they do for themselves. And this can be, perhaps in this context, best summarised by Eisenhower, I think it's Eisenhower, who said to people coming to lobby him about issues that mattered to do with the industry policy and depression, he said, I agree with you, now go out there and make me do it. What we need to do in this organising, what we need to do in social policy is challenge people to actually engage for themselves in their own power, come together in their organisations and demand their stake in the policy debates around the things that affect them. Consultation is nowhere near enough, and peaks who can't turn out the people from their peak organisations, they're a trap just as well, because they're not engaging the people who are part of that in that type 2 thinking where they're really wrestling with the difficulties of problems. They're not challenging that culture which says it's just the experts and the few that do it. So just to finish, and then I'll hand over, the organising that I do is based on many ways the work of a man called Saul Alinsky. And he said that change means movement, and movement means friction, which means heat and tension. And part of the challenge of this work is getting comfortable with that tension, getting comfortable not having all of the control and the power and the difficulty. This is also a good point for the minister. But instead saying, I'm going to cede some of that and I'm going to deal with the complexity of it with the community who deal with this. And it might mean that we don't get to decide everything that happens, but it means that actually there's some co-ownership and there's some sharing of the inequalities of power at the heart of some of the wicked problems that we face. So that was a big theoretical thing. I'll now hand over to Anne and she'll introduce the others. Thank you.
So it's always good to have the provocateurs begin, and I think there is a real theme around elites and the extent to which the politics of what's going on is telling us that people are very dissatisfied with the way that our current processes are working. Minister, I might hand over to you. Can people were aware that you were held up in question time. It's a real pleasure to have the Honourable Shannon Fentiman MP, Minister for Communities, Women, Youth, Minister for Child Safety and Minister for the Prevention of Domestic and Family Violence here at the function today. And our original plan was that you would introduce the forum. So welcome and thank you for coming, and I'll hand over to you.
As much as I would have loved to get out of question time, I'm very pleased to be with you all today, and I'm sorry I am running late. public policy. So great to see you again, Dave, and to hear you talk so passionately about organising. Can I also acknowledge the Griffith University Policy Innovation Hub, who have organised this wonderful event, and of course each and every one of you for coming along to Parliament to be engaged in this discussion. It is fantastic to see so many leading experts in the field come together to share ideas about the future of social investment here in Queensland. As I outlined in my address to the Committee for Economic Development of Australia earlier this year, a decline in manufacturing, cyclical downturns, and a workforce reliant on casual employment poses a great challenge to Queensland's economic future, as well as the promise of a fairer and more equal society. And it is evident, and I know that this has been widely discussed among economists and world leaders, that inequality is an impediment to growth. And we clearly need to look at ways of reducing social and income inequality as a way of growing Queensland's economy into the future. Investment in human capital, and that is investment in the infrastructure and services that lift people out of poverty and disadvantage, is one way to boost revenue and grow our economy. And here in Queensland, we are in a unique position where our community services industry is one of our state's fastest growing and most dynamic sectors. Today, 45,000 Queenslanders work in the community services industry. It contributes around $3.5 billion to the Queensland economy every year. And this is expected to multiply in line with projected growth for the industry to $6.3 billion by 2025. And by 2025, we predict there will be at least 30,000 new jobs in the community services industry. The industry is clearly on a path to strong growth with great potential to build on its valuable contribution to Queensland's economic and social well-being. To meet the needs of this growing sector, we have already begun working with the Community Services Industry Alliance, Belinda and her team, to develop a 10-year strategy and action plan. This draws on the Forecasting the Future report that I launched earlier this year with Belinda and Deloitte, and I'm sure Belinda will touch on some of the data in this report during the panel discussion. Our government is looking at new ways to invest to achieve better outcomes for vulnerable individuals and families. In this year's budget, I was very proud that we had a $25 million initiative for financial resilience. So it includes the introduction of 2 new Good Money stores, which will offer fair, safe and affordable options for people on low incomes. So we've partnered with Good Shepherd Microfinance and the NAB to open 2 new stores, one in Cairns and one on the Gold Coast. And they really will be rivals to the cash converters and other unscrupulous payday lenders. And one of the other reasons I'm very excited about this is because in my capacity as Minister for Women, we also know that women are the fastest growing clients of some of these unscrupulous payday lenders, and more women are retiring without any superannuation and income at all, and are the fastest growing homeless population in this country. We are leading the way through our innovative corporate community government partnerships, which I think is an excellent example of the community services industry lifting individuals out of disadvantage while in turn growing our economy. And of course, we've also invested in the wonderful Logan Together initiative, a unique joint partnership between local, state and federal governments, community organisations, and it uses a collective impact framework for long-term, practical and robust social development planning. And I'm excited, of course, being the member for Waterford, in which hosts Griffith University's Logan campus, which is the backbone organisation for Logan Together. And we really are looking at this as a new way to invest in community services going forward. So it is very exciting, and I've no doubt Matthew will talk a lot about it today. My department is also working closely with Treasury and other agencies to deliver our first social benefit bonds, an emerging form of social investment which will facilitate new and vital collaboration between government and the social and private sectors. We are piloting 3 social benefit bonds in the areas of reoffending, homelessness and issues affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I'm really excited to see some of the shortlisted projects that will soon be coming forward with innovative ideas to tackle, as we heard before, some of these wicked social problems. I believe it is so fundamental that we challenge some of our old ways of working as we move forward into the future where community services becomes one of our major industries. That's why forums like this one are so vital. It's an opportunity for all of us to share ideas, to discuss new ways forward, new ways of investing in our community services industry. It can be a powerful force that drives Queensland's equity, productivity and prosperity into the future. So thank you again to Griffith University Policy Innovation Hub and our wonderful panel members for organising this event. I'm sorry it is a late introduction, but I'm very pleased to be here and to be able to welcome you all to Parliament House. So I hope you enjoy the forum. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I think, Dave's given us a big challenge about the way all of us need to contribute expertise and resources. Thanks very much. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Matthew Cox from Logan Together to talk about some of the interesting and innovative work that's going on down there. Matthew.
Thanks, Anne. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Yagara and Turrbal people who are the custodians of the land that we're meeting on, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present and emerging. And I'm really pleased to tell you a bit about Logan Together for those of you who aren't already intimately involved, and there's a lot of you in the room who spend large parts of your working life obsessed with Logan Together and all of its constituent parts, so this won't be news to you guys. Before I start, I just better confess I've got a serious case of man flu happening. What you might experience as a bit of a runny nose and a sore throat, I'm experiencing as the early stages of Ebola. I just tell you that because if I don't quite make it through my talk, I haven't registered on the organ donor register, and I'd like you to do that for me, and if you could please tell my wife I'm sorry for everything that I did wrong. All right. I better start by telling you making some observations about Logan, the community, and its role in our society. Logan's an incredibly successful place. It's one of the fastest growing parts of Australia. It's got a very significant gross regional product, which Councillor Stacey McIntosh, you would know off the top of your head, is what? $16 billion, I think, is the answer, something like that. It's got a really diverse economy, retail, manufacturing, logistics, IT, biomedical, and soon medical and other services. It's a really diverse physical landscape. It's very beautiful. There's a lot of rural hinterland, riverscapes. This is perhaps, for those of you who haven't spent a lot of time in Logan, maybe not the entire picture that you had of the community, but it's important to start there. The other fantastic thing about Logan is it does one incredibly important job for our community that not every part of our state does, and that is it welcomes people from all over the world and from every walk of life to make a start in life, or perhaps to make a restart on their life's journey. It does that job superbly well. It does it with a minimum of fuss. It does it very, very successfully, and for thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, they get their first step on the ladder of prosperity in places like Logan. Now, not every suburb in our community has that role. Most, such as the suburb I live in central Brisbane, don't have to worry about that particular task. So I think Logan is a place we should celebrate, and we should be thankful for the role it plays in the Queensland community. There are other places like Logan, but I think Logan does it superbly well. And if you look at perhaps some of the cohesion problems that do occur in some of our other cities, in Melbourne and Sydney, I think we're blessedly free of those challenges because of the fantastic way Logan does that job. Now, it's not to say that job doesn't come with challenge. It certainly does. If you look at the Queensland population in general, the Western liberal democratic capitalist system has delivered for about 80% of us, about 8 out of 10 of us, a quality of life that's unparalleled in human history. For a while there, we were the wealthiest country on earth when the exchange rate was high. And certainly, if you had to choose a time and a place to be born, not many people would argue that being born in Australia in contemporary times isn't the very best place to wind up. So we're the happiest, healthiest, wealthiest generation of people perhaps ever to walk the earth. It doesn't get much better than this for 80% of us. For 20% of us, roughly, about 14% of that 20% experience some level of social exclusion. We can't fend for ourselves, perhaps in old age and retirement. We perhaps go through episodes of crisis we need some support for. For another 6% of us, so 14 plus 6 being about 20%, for about 6% of us, we're very, very heavily reliant on systems and support systems that are available in our community, including compulsive systems like criminal justice system and child safety system, etc. That's roughly the profile of Queensland society. And it's pretty stark that the system that has worked so well to create so much wealth for most of us really hasn't done the job for the 20% of us who are partly or quite a lot excluded from that. And it's really that task that Logan Together is trying to attack or show the way forward on. How do we try a different way to address the needs of perhaps a fifth of the population? So I'll tell you a little bit about it for those of you who don't already know. On the surface of it, Logan Together is a child development project, and we're critically interested in the futures of 45,000 kids under 8 in Logan. Now, 2/3 of those kids are already doing great because it's a prosperous place, as I've said, but about 1/3 of kids in Logan are going to need some extra help to reach their potential, and that's more than the population share should be. So on the surface, it's a child development project, but really underneath it's an anti-poverty, it's a community uplift, it's an intergenerational community development project, because we know that kids who do well at age 8 almost always go on to be teenagers who do better, who then go on to be adults who do better. And conceptually it's pretty simple. We know that if you want to produce a crop of healthy 8-year-olds, you don't start that project when those kids are 8. Indeed, the place to start is before they're born. And the program logic, if you want to put it that way, is get kids born healthy. Making sure that we've got a sophisticated and variable school program that meets everybody's needs, and we provide the supports that kids need. And it's underpinned by some important things like secure housing and employment, etc. The formula is pretty simple. We actually know what to do. We know what to do at each and every one of those human development stages. Our challenge is to do it for every kid, and to do it longitudinally. So not just some kids at some ages on some issues at some stages, which is largely where I find society has evolved to. In contrast to that model, that longitudinal, life course-based, universal model that assures that kids grow up well, and through that slow but steady process sees the prosperity and the capacity of the population change as those kids age into teenagehood and then into adulthood. Set against that model, which is the one we're shooting for, I think we've arrived after maybe 40 years of social services investment at quite a different place. We see through reasons that are pretty obvious that we've invested, we've seen particular social issues and we've invested in responses to those particular social issues. We've seen homelessness problems and we've launched homelessness programs. We've seen mental health problems and we've launched mental health programs. We've seen joblessness problems and we've launched jobs programs. These are all good things and they're necessary and they're here to stay and they're an important part of the future. But what we're left with is an incredibly fragmented, problem-focused investment strategy that's either focused on specific issues at specific points in time or specific cohorts in their life experiences, usually cohorts that are highly correlated with things going wrong. So we have locked ourselves accidentally, I think, after 30 or 40 years of investment across the state, federal and local governments and in the philanthropic sector into this incredibly fragmented, problem-focused harm mitigation cycle where we wait for a problem to occur, we get in and we invest and we try and knock the rough edges off it. And I think at the population level, the evidence is pretty clear. This hasn't worked. This hasn't led to social development. This hasn't led to social change. what it's led to is really cycling a fairly defined population of people through repeated crisis and crisis response experiences. We're actually pretty good at solving immediate challenges. We're pretty good at, if Matthew doesn't have a house, we're pretty good at finding him some accommodation and giving him some stabilisers so he gets out of that immediate crisis situation. We're pretty lousy at asking the question, why couldn't Matthew sort his housing situation out for himself? And how can we work away at this over 1 or 2 years, 3 years, to make sure his capability is built and his circumstances are improved for the long term? We're pretty lousy at that as a society and as a system. How did we get here? Well, look, you know, the modern human services, social services complex is a pretty new beast, to be honest. So we needn't, we've put it in place over a relatively short period of time, so we needn't despair about our abilities or our capabilities to change it. If you think about it, as you may know, you know, the really big features of the social safety net in Australia are really post-Second World War features. The dole, social housing, all appeared post-war. The rise of social services, as we know, has risen largely since the 70s. Here in Queensland, things like the family support system, homelessness, preventative mental health, these are incredibly recent. Really since, in terms of family development and family support, really since the Ford inquiry in 1999. That's when a lot of the current investment in family support and other things have appeared. So we've done it recently. It's a bit of a hodgepodge where it can be undone, it can be changed and it can be transformed. So what has that left us with? Well, I think this fragmentation, this focus on programmatic responses, issue-based responsives, cohort responses, has left us with an inability to stand back from human development and community development and say, how do we change the population level outcomes for particular places over time forever, for good? We've lost that ability, we've lost the focus. We don't pay people to obsess about those challenges. We pay most of our people to do stuff, to launch responses on particular issues. So we need to regain a capacity and interest and the time and effort and focus to come back to those big strategic questions of how can we make society better over the long haul. My experience working with many of you in putting Logan together is that we actually know what to do. We've got a credible execution strategy. We've got a credible strategy that's evidenced in other places to make big change. What we don't have is the plumbing, the infrastructure, the societal, the government, the funding infrastructure to move that forward at scale. So what we're trying to do in Logan is, at a pretty big trial site scale, Logan's about 7% of the Queensland population, is prove it can be done. And the things that are hard, we'll sticky tape over and we'll tie them up with string and we'll beg favours to try and get it to work and to prove it can be done. We can then turn our attention later to the question of how can we do it everywhere or elsewhere. So while that sort of question of how do we do it everywhere and elsewhere is a bit ahead of us, I've got a few thoughts about what that might look like. And before I move on, I had this amazing conversation with one of our colleagues, Mark Moran, who's a professor of development effectiveness at UQ last week. It was one of those moments where the challenge or the opportunity is so stark that I thought I'd just have to tell you about it. So Mark's spent a career in overseas and remote community development in Australia, international development and remote community development, and he's become obsessed with how we can do things better, particularly in remote communities in Australia. And he was telling me about some studies he'd just been doing, and he wrote a book that was quite well received just a few months ago, about the institutional investment in remote communities in Australia. And one community I won't name in the Northern Territory of 300 people, his credible verified research is that 90 services were servicing that community of 300 people. Now we know this to be true, and those of you like me who've done some work in Queensland discrete communities know this is true, maybe not to that degree. But Mark actually did some work with the World Bank, and he couldn't find another environment anywhere in the world, anywhere in the developing world, that was so, in his words, so institutionally crowded. So when you stand back from it and you hear that, and you think about that, it gives you great impetus to make things different, because this is just a crazy way to set ourselves up. And there's very, very little in the way of effective coordination of that activity, and we can gain so much by just taking some small steps forward in making that investment coherent. So that's what we're trying to do in Logan, is make that investment coherent. And we've got to do the obvious things you've got to do. You've got to bring together who's on the other end of all of those investments in terms of policy and funding practice. You also got to bring together the people who operationalise those things. So governance is important, and we've created a whole lot of local level governance structures that allow us to look at the picture in its entirety and make decisions about it together and bring some coherency to it. Pretty clearly, the other thing we've got to do is have some investment and some capability in the coherency mechanism. So you can get so far by everybody sort of taking time out of their day job and coming together and making some good observations, but without some direct, clear, focused investment on understanding the resources that are going into our community, how it could and should be better, and how we need to change it, you're really up against it. So that's in some ways what my small team, I've got a team of 5 people, it's our campaign team is what we describe it as. That's what we're there to do, but really working with the intelligence and the integrity and the interests of partners across government and non-government. And I think it comes down to, moving forward, I think it comes down to 4 key things that we have to do. If we want to make this shift, if we want to get back in the driver's seat of social investment, we want to get back into a sense of ambition and aspiration for busting poverty, delivering community uplift, whatever you want to call it. Firstly, you've got to have belief that it can be done, and I think there's evidence that it can be done. We don't have to tolerate the current state of affairs. We can change this. We do have a credible strategy, so you've got to believe it. You've then got to mount an initiative that is about social change. It is about social change at the population level. You have to look it square in the eye and say, we're here to do something on this task at this scale. Let's conceptualise what might be required. You have to deal with causality in that framework. You have to understand what's causing the social impacts, and you have to burrow in there, as complex as they may be, and deal with them. And again, the irony is we haven't found that this is a knowing problem. We know what to do. We've got lots and lots of information about the things that make a difference. If you take your framework from human development, how human beings grow, how communities function, we've actually got a whole bunch of stuff we know about how to make that go right. We just need to operationalise it. Operationalising it takes investments across health, education, social services, the community and the community environment, and it's the doing problem. It's how you stitch all that plumbing together. So we need to be about social change, we need to deal with causality, we need to think about human development, we need to marshal our resources in a coherent way, and that's where I think there's a very big role for place-based thinking. So much of this investment lands with coherency only in a particular geography or a particular community. And we need to, I think, understand and have a tolerance for an ability to invest within place-based contexts with the appropriate governance and with the appropriate rigour. But we need to have a tolerance for a graduated, differentiated, place-based strategy that combines the resources across all of those sectors with some coherence. And that needs investment, and that needs thinking, and that needs skills at that level. It seems so obvious, people live their lives in particular geographic communities. That is the most obvious frame to consider how we want to make lives better. Lastly, I'll come full circle and come back to what Dave was saying, but in much kinder, nicer words. We fundamentally must alter our relationship with the communities we seek to serve in these places. Otherwise, we'll have better connected, better thought through, better delivered wrong things. The power relationship, the involvement of local people means we will do the right things. We will respond to real needs, and we will respond to real aspirations and tap into real motivations. They may be some of the things that we think need doing, and they may be some of the things that we don't think need doing, but local people think need doing. And through that responsiveness and trust building, that power sharing, this is just absolutely a critical ingredient. All of that, of course, is on community uplift, it's on private schools, etc. But it's a huge number, and I think if we get 10% better at doing this, we all save a whole lot of money, we all avoid a whole lot of human misery, and we can all retire to the beach and live a life of leisure. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. So there's a lot of learning and lesson drawing to be done, which is, of course, why public policy people are very interested in these things. I've got my eye on the time. Belinda, can I hand over to you? I need to leave time for questions and discussion.
It's okay, I'll be...
No, you
I don't need
occupy
my-
a space like the boys do.
I don't need my... no, I've decided, as the last speaker, as is often the case, that it's not worth going through the slides. I've made a presentation up on the spot. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose land we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and congratulate Matthew as well for making it through his presentation without falling on the floor and needing resuscitation. So just by way of introduction, I guess in the theme of Dave, I'd like to give you a bit of context and background about me. I have spent most of my 20 years in and around the community services space, and as I was sitting listening to the presentations, I was reflecting on the sort of thing that gets me excited about working in the space, and reflected on some of my early experiences in my social work degree, doing my social work practical placements, and being captured very early on by the power of community organisations and what they contribute to the social fabric in which we all live, and the value of them in terms of how they capture the needs and issues of many very highly vulnerable people across our community, how they engage through their workforce a bunch of people who are extremely values driven and intent on making social change, and how, you know, as we're hearing more and more, certainly through the Minister's speech, they make effectively also an economic contribution to our communities and to our society. So I am going to stand here and tell you I am an unashamed fan of community organisations. So that's probably why I find myself in the role that I'm in an organisation that's been formed only in the last couple of years to focus on, unashamedly, community organisations and the work that they do. But with a little bit of a twist, something a bit different from the usual kind of peak body, I guess, in the sense that our goal is not to focus on the social issues, but rather to focus on the organisational form itself. Really taking what is often opaque, and that is the business of community service delivery, and looking at it hard and working out how it can be improved. And the reason for doing that is for all of the reasons that Dave and Matthew have talked about, and that is because ultimately we want to deliver better outcomes for people. We want to be, through that action, a better community and a better society. So I guess I'm standing here at the end of these three presentations, kind of drawing the thread from that sort of citizen participation, people and community dimension of what Dave talked about, through the piece that Matthew's talking about, I think, which is around the evidence we have for the sorts of problems our society faces, and the design of the sorts of interventions, responses, supports and activities we go about doing in order to make change, make people's lives better. And, you know, as many of us know, those ways of working are captured inside the operations of community organisations on a daily basis. But community organisations are really important in this discussion in another way, because remember, we came here to talk to you, actually in our discussions and our planning, to be provocative around this idea of social investment. You know, when I hear that term, I think of my 10 years spent in the social impact investment space. But we're talking about in 2025, $6.3 billion we'll spend in Queensland on community service delivery. So we're here to stir the pot, really, around whether the way we're doing that is the best way to do it, and I think we're concluding rapidly that it's not. But there's a problem that we face as we look at that issue, and that is that traditionally, up until this point, and I'll come to some changes that are challenging that, that 6.3 billion or the 4.7 billion or whatever it is currently in the state is largely captured through the institutional form of community organisations. So although talking about the business of community service delivery might seem an odd thing to do and a bit out of context with the, the passion and the purpose of changing people's lives, but in fact these organisations are an absolutely critical part of our success or failure in terms of the way that we invest in social services. So that's changing though. So we all know about the introduction, no doubt, of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And that funding reform is shifting the investment in human services in that space out of the hands of organisations. So we're moving from an organisational centric model to a people-centric model. And as we do that, we are causing untold shake-up in the community services industry. And I think probably in a pretty rough and ready way. We were talking earlier in another forum. It's actually a pretty crude tool for significant business and organisational change that's happening at the moment. So it's a really big experiment, as are the other reforms in aged care, in taking a pretty big chunk of investment and reorienting it in the system in a different way, and then, to be really frank, crossing our fingers a little bit that all that works out in terms of meeting the needs of people and having as well organisations in our communities and in our society in order to deliver those services. Now, I am not anti that reform, and I'm not anti-NDIS, and I spent many, many years working in direct services with people with disability, and I understand the basis for the reform. But as we go about making that organisational change, we do need to ask ourselves some questions around how rough and ready we do it, or do we find a gentler way? Do we find a way to hold on to some of the strengths of what community organisations possess and build on those strengths? Or do we wash all that down the river and come up with a new system that right now, as we stand here, we don't really know is going to work any better than the one we've got. I guess, although we've got sort of in the description I've given kind of an old model that we sort of think is broken in terms of investment, and we've got a new model that's emerging that's, providing some hope in terms of doing it differently. I guess the challenge I'm putting to the audience is a bit of a buyer beware one. As we rush down the path of this change, we need to be careful we don't throw out the good with the bad. As we rush down this path, we do need to hold on to the original intent, which was to provide better outcomes for people, and we shouldn't land the criticism of our failure to do so all at the feet of community organisations. I guess in order to kind of round out my remarks, I wanted really to come to the less critical and the more positive. If we think about investment and to the great and grand and really important experiment of Logan together, and we think about the sorts of things in terms of investment that are going to help us in that space, Matthew's already raised this idea of devolving investment. So currently a lot of the investment, as we all know, is controlled in the ivory towers of government, in many respects appropriately so, but the distance that's grown up between what's happening on the ground for people and the decisions that get made about how investment happens, perhaps that gap has widened so far now that some of what we're doing doesn't make sense. So some sort of devolution of investment seems to be important in this discussion. The other thing that I think is important is that our investment base needs to become more diversified. So the social benefit bonds that Minister Fentiman mentioned, our access and use of philanthropy and corporate social responsibility activities in that space, making more of that so that we are not only reliant on a single form of investment. So diversification, and that might not always be in cash, it might also be in better utilising existing underutilised assets that we have across our community. And I think, you know, to land again back in where Dave started us off, that it seems to me that we're going back to the future in terms of community development. I did my social work degree with a major in community development, and I think in the 20-odd years that I've been in community services, we've almost seen the complete loss of any kind of skill or capacity or real, you know, sense of methodology in that sort of space. And I think, again, in terms of this discussion around investment and how we invest in the future, taking an approach to investment that is in some way community directed, influenced highly by the needs of the people that the investment is designed to help, also seems to be really, really sensible. So my concluding remarks would be to go back to the PowerPoint slide I didn't show you, which has a really, really pretty diagram on there, which is effectively a hothouse. And inside the hothouse are all these little seedlings that are growing up. And when we did the presentation originally together, one of the things that I was really saying is that Logan Together is a seedling popping its head out of the dirt in a pot in a hothouse. And it's protected from all of the elements, it's protected from all of the ordinary winds of change. It's, you know, kind of cloistered a bit and looked after in terms, Matthew might not feel like that day to day, but anyway, just imagine that for a moment, Matthew. Why that's a kind of important analogy, I think, is because what we do need to do is commit ourselves to putting some protection around the experiments that help us see the future differently. And then if we grow that plant strong in the hothouse and it grows its own seeds, then what we've got the opportunity to do is transplant them elsewhere across the system. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I've really got my eye on the time, so I might throw straight to questions. There's some very provocative thoughts.
And I think businesses are, sorry, I'm a little nervous thinking I'm looking. Businesses are where you will see growth in the economy, and kind of, you don't need to, you don't need all of us and all the stuff, you just need to engage more with people. You should engage more instead of that.
Okay, so I think the point is that so far the discussion's too much about the internal kind of cliques of policymakers and not enough about business. How do you respond, you three? Thank you very much. No, I think it's an important discussion.
Look, I think this is a fundamental point that I think we have to step across the line and realise we're not going to social service our way into prosperity. You know, I spent 10 years at the Red Cross running the Human Services Program in Queensland. We did great work. We helped people with all sorts of things. It's a real necessary set of supports to provide. But people get up in the morning to achieve things, to live life, to, you know, meet boys, meet girls, you know, grow businesses, learn things, have fun. You know, these are the things that make for good human life. And these are the things that drag people forward and motivate them. So I think we need absolutely investment in social inclusion, social connection, economic development, community cohesion. These are the things that pull society forward. The support services are necessary so you can get there, but the investment portfolio, in my view, is really unbalanced. We're focused on lots of problems, and we need much more investment on pulling people forward.
Down the front.
Just a quick comment is that I think business is very good at delivering some things and some services. And I think there's other parts of needs that people have which aren't delivered by business and never will be. And often have been traditionally delivered by family and community. And so business is not the only solution. And if we take the business approach of saying community services should be delivered like businesses, then we're missing part of the point, which is actually what we need to have is support for people, not just to either be an employee or a business owner or that, but also to be engaged in their community and have a voice around things that matter to them, you know, and to be involved in their P&C and to be involved in other processes. So I think it's one of the dangers I see in the reform is we say it's all going down a market-based approach, and the market's really good for some things and really terrible for others. It's not a place where, it's not a great place to find meaning. It's not a great place to find some of the other things that matter in life. And so I guess what we need to do is understand the distinctions and the differences.
Yeah, but I think there's sort of ecosystems might be your point of yeah, yeah.
What gives meaning to your life? You get up every day and you go and do something that you love, and people don't realise not all the work is like that, and
Yeah.
people really hate their jobs, in which case they should seek other employment.
I'm just keen to move on to the next question if we can, but I think we're talking about ecosystems, and this is very consistent with the literature on a lot of this kind of stuff, and it's no accident that the hub's based in the business school. So I know David Grant, the PPC Business, will be really interested in the potential of, you know, the private and social enterprise dimensions of what's going on at Logan. There's a lady down the front.
I'm Robin. I've been involved with the Logan Renewal Initiative, and so for the past year I've been heavily involved with the tenants in Logan. So our tenants are some of the most vulnerable residents in our community. This program would have provided lots of jobs, lots of housing, and lots of additional funds for that program. So given that it's all about social innovation, I just was interested in the panel's comments on what do you think, you know, led to the demise of that program.
So for people who aren't in the know, there's a bit of controversy around a political decision that's been taken by the government to here in Queensland to not go ahead with a transfer of stock, as I understand it, into community management. And it's been all over question time today. To the panel?
Handed that one. So I think it's a combination of, particularly in the housing space in Queensland, a long succession of uncertainty in terms of housing policy. And I'm not going to be kind of partisan in my comments. It goes back now over kind of 2 successive governments, numbers of, you know, changes at the level of the politicians, you know, working to help set the agenda, and numbers of changes perhaps at a senior level of the public service. So I think there's a fundamental kind of point around political instability across that policy issue.
And I'd add there's been a policy vacuum at the national level since 1996.
Yes,
but
perhaps. I also think, and these comments, you know, may or may not be controversial, but I also think in the case of the Logan Initiative, that it has got caught up in some political ideology about what constitutes outsourcing or what constitutes not outsourcing social services or housing. And, you know, I think in the last period of time, and it's not controversial to say this, we have seen, you know, a very clear shift in policy that kind of gets to, you know, an idea or a focus that the best way to provide housing to people is for that to be done through a public housing framework. So I think that that initiative has fallen victim to, you know, really a lack of policy coherence, and then also a circumstance of politics.
Helen Ferguson, down the front.
Thank you. I want you to go further. I want you to be more provocative. So this is my challenge to you. Belinda, you mentioned NDIS.
going to achieve their goals that they've identified for themselves. An incredible shift. So my challenge to you all is, where else can that happen? How else can we put people in the driving seat and for them to purchase the supports they need, and for us to trust that they will purchase the supports that they need to achieve the goals that they've set?
Thank you, Helen. And I think what you've done in a way is just to crystallise in my mind to maybe the point I was trying to make. So I think that the shift to putting people in the driver's seat is absolutely, unarguably the right thing to do. I think then, as we go about doing that, what we need to do is look at the context in which that choice and control is being exercised, and make sure that we're doing all the right things, to enable that. So then hence my argument around, if we don't have community organisations, or indeed actually local businesses in communities aware of the opportunity to provide new and different supports to people based on their exercise of choice and control, then we will have failed in that great reform. If we were to identify other areas in which I think you could press, particularly at a state level, the child and family space is an obvious one. There you go, Matthew.
I mean, I think it is all about putting people in the driver's seat. But I do think there's real caution about what are those circumstances in which it's best to do that on an individualised basis, and what's it best to do as a community. Principle's the same, but there's a whole range of things that are best, I think, understood, agreed, moved forward on as a collective, as a community. And I think there's a lot of peril. You could get really excited about the individualised voucher stuff, and you could wind up in a bit of a mess, I think. So I think we need to be absolutely open to it, but I think we've got to be pretty cautious and assess each particular opportunity fairly carefully, and not be afraid to say, actually, there are things that we as a group, we as a herd, need to be deciding. Principles are the same, though. I'd also say one of the tenets we've tried to stick very clearly to with our work in Logan Together is that this is a whole of society initiative, and that includes our partners in government, our partners in the non-government sector, our partners in the private sector, and community members. And it's not a power over model that any one particular stakeholder group, wins. It's a whole of society, because that's, at the end of the day, governments are our institutions. They're our community institutions. So,
Jenny Gamble, and then there's a lady over there.
Thanks so much. This is super interesting. I'm delighted to be here. There's been quite a lot of talk about altering the relationship with communities. Power sharing is critical, and sort of new ways of responding and doing business with the community. But some of our sort of macro structures sort of work against that in terms of holding to account. So, for instance, in health, we have these HHSs, and in fact, they're not elected, they're appointed, and there's no transparent accountability to their communities. And the elected representatives, the people we actually vote for, seem to have very little real call to account. So, if we're going to get this power sharing thing happening, how do we address the macro structures that are in fact inhibiting that?
Ooh, a big governance question.
Yeah, I mean, HHS so the Health and Hospital Services of the state, but there's also the primary health networks. And, in some ways, health has not been wonderful at being held accountable in Queensland for ages, but I'm equally worried about the primary health networks in terms of these are for-profit. Their company is set up to effectively be the primary network to deliver the services that used to be the Medicare locals, and in some cases there's no accountability. The Queensland Community Alliance, just to give you a quick story, in Ipswich we had a whole lot of stories around problems with delivery of mental health services and a buck passing, between the feds and the state government. Obviously we had the Barrett Centre there, and the real example of failure of policy of closing down something without a solution in place which led to the death of 3 young people. in February, where a woman called Jules, who has been living with mental illness for a long time and has a daughter with mental illness, was able to hold the CEO of the Health and Hospital Service and the CEO of the PHN to account and just say, this is what's going on for me, and I want to see something change, and have her say yes, and all of the community say this is important to us. So that's one of the reasons why we believe that there needs to be that vehicle of civil society organising to hold these structures to account. And it's not just the minister, it's these quangos, these quasi-non-governmental organisations or other structures.
There's a term I haven't heard in Queensland for a long time. This lady over here.
Hi, Natasha from Deloitte. Thank you very much. Great presentation from all of you, so thank you. I just wanted to put forward something, Matthew, you mentioned that we know what works already. So my question is, why haven't we been just investing in that and doing it from the get-go? And then to Linda, you mentioned that, you know, with NDIS coming and there'll be change with organisations, why haven't those organisations already changed the way they do things, and why can't we be accepted of the creative destruction within the community services organisation and the evolution of it to embrace that change and change the way that they do practices to deliver better outcomes for society. So it's not necessarily a question directed at both of you, but also I say, where is government in this argument? Because that's where most of this money is coming from, and I increasingly find it frustrating that we find evidence about what works, but the funding models don't support the development and implementation of those models within practice. And so that's where my frustration comes from. So
I've got to say I'm feeling pretty good about my curriculum design right now. Anyway, sorry for my students who are in the room.
Thank you, Natasha. You've half answered the question too. When, you know, I mean, the program logic often in terms of investment sits on high, you know, and the decisions that are being kind of made, or the investigation being done about how to organise services differently at the local level, are really disconnected from that often. So that's a challenge to try and join that up. I haven't heard the term creative destruction before, so thank you. I'm introduced to a new idea. And I don't have an issue at all, I'm not being protectionist in my comments. I don't have an issue at all with some community organisations no longer existing in the future because of the grand reform of CDC or NDIS. I don't have an issue with that at all. If it's not good, it shouldn't be done. It shouldn't persist. But I do have a problem with the idea that the mechanisms by which organisations have been funded, which have influenced highly the way that they do business, are ignored in the context of the reform agenda. So, you know, I'm more than happy for creative destruction to occur, but let's make sure that we see that in the context of all of the regulatory and funding limitations that have been imposed on these businesses that in other contexts in the private sector would quite frankly never ever be accepted.
Very quickly, Matthew, we've got one last question.
Well, so I'll just deal with the very simple question of, if we've known what to do, why haven't we done it? Look, I think it's about seeing it. You know that story about the Northern Territory community where you've got 300 people and 90 organisations servicing. You have to see that before you realise just the extent of what you're dealing with. And then you have to do the sums, as they've done in New Zealand. They now have totted it all up and worked out, whoa, this is really, really expensive. And then you can do something about it. And then it takes there's a bit of a lag before you line up all the plumbing and deal with all the institutional change and all the programmatic change. So I think we see it now. We've got some examples where people have seen it and done it. And so I think we'll move fairly quickly.
Last question to Leslie Chenoweth, because she's the boss at Logan. She's running. And while you're kind of commenting, while we're getting the microphone, I mean, there's some pretty wicked politics as well as the pretty wicked problems here. And, you know, one has a sense that reforming politics becomes a very important part of this dimension. So we've got good governance as one of our themes. Whether we make any progress, of course, remains to be seen. Leslie.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment, but I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this. We are embarking on some pretty major social innovation in terms of Logan Together and indeed the NDIS. And I think there's a lot to be learned while we're doing that. I think we could already learn for Logan Together and other initiatives what have we learned about the whole rollout of the NDIS? I mean, there's some good and it's hugely disruptive. So, I think I'm concerned that we aren't organised around how do we learn through the processes, that we reflect on that and then we can steer the newer innovations as they're rolling out. The thing with the NDIS is that we have had a lot of investment in community service providers, and a lot of them didn't want to change. A lot of them didn't know how to change. This is so confronting. But my question, I think, Dave, maybe you've got something to say about this, is if we're putting people in the driver's seat, then we should be investing in the people so that they become informed customers of their services, and they're not then at the mercy of so-called experts who say, look, this is what you need. And I think we've got a long way to go with that.
Last word to Dave Copeman.
Well, informed's one thing, but you can have all the information in the world. If you're just one person and that's all you've got as an individual, you're still faced up with an incredibly complex circumstance. I mean, I'm scared really in the NDIS in two things. One, how does it apply to mental health, which is coming along, and you've got people with variable capacity and variable lifetime of illness with a model that wasn't necessarily designed around that. And two, there's the other agenda, and this is the politics piece, is there's also a political agenda to say, how do we put a cap on expenses? And how do we, while we give people control, also hand the responsibility to them, that if they don't have enough money, it's their co-payments that have to live up to it, and if they don't have enough cash for the co-payment, then whoops, we can't deal with it. While the baby boomers are retiring, all of a sudden we move from a certain standard of care to a certain amount of money. You know, the agenda here is not entirely just about choice and control. It's also about passing the buck on where the blame for cost sits. So, I mean, my response is that, and there was a discussion at Progress with COTA and Choice and Carers Australia about how does this community organise? And how do they, there was some wonderful organising to lead to the NDIS. There's going to need to be just as much, because the creative destruction that Shumbata talks about in this case are going to be people's lives in some cases, of people whose money is not spent the right way, or don't get the services they need, or get taken for a ride. And it's going to be, the response is, oh, well, your mistake. It's your fault, your life. So it gets me worried. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, that's a spot to finish, isn't it? But I'm conscious of the time, and, we'd like to offer you a drink after, those provocative thoughts. I think, to me, there's a call to action to most of the people in this room around the agenda, but there's also something, and, when you're working on something and sometimes it's all you see, this notion of kind of platforms to make meaning and to make sense. Of what's going on, because I think you're right, Leslie. I think the capacity for learning as we go is actually not embedded. So I think the research community really needs to step up to that in lots of ways. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and I hope people have got time, have enjoyed it and have got time to hang around and have a drink with us at the back of the room. You should always have a drink when you come to Parliament, because you can't get into the parliamentary bar anymore, and it serves coffee now, not like the old days. So can you join me in thanking our three fabulous presenters? No one will want to talk to Matthew for fear of contagion, but the other two should be pretty right in terms of questions over drinks. Please join us down the back.